afternoon, depending where you are. Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Raj and team, for the invite to be here today and talk about my experience. And also thank you to everyone here for your time, taking some time out of your day to listen to my presentation. So I'm here today to talk about my experience when it comes to maturing application security programs. And you see that a lot of things here is not just related to application security. You could apply that to cloud security too as well. These are basically the things that I've seen in the past, things that I've done in the past, especially in my current organization that has worked out. Of course, it might not apply to every single organization of every single size, but at least from my experience from small to mid-sized businesses, these are a set of steps that tend to work well. So I'm first going to go through some typical challenges that I've seen in the past and some challenges that I faced myself with my team very, very recently. And then after that, I'll go through the step-by-step that I personally followed and that I've seen other leaders following as well, that basically helps a program like this to mature. And so just to, before we get that, I just wanted to introduce myself for those who I don't know. So my name is Renan Dias. I'm part of here, the PBC community. Currently work as an engineering manager at VTS, and I focus solely on, security engineering. But I've, held multiple hats over my career. I started out as a software engineer focusing on iOS, front end, and back end. But even at that time, I was always focusing on the security side of things. I've always had this, curious side for security. So whenever I would come across new concept, I would always find a way to get myself involved with the security aspect of it. And then moving on from software engineer, I started working as an infrastructure engineer. So that's when I started getting more exposed to everything else related to infrastructure, networks, operating system, cloud. That was the time I switched and started working more on the cloud environments. AWS is the main cloud provider I've been working with for the past 10 plus years now. And then from there, I progressed to a solutions architect. Always focus on not only the infrastructure and the software, but the security side of things. I spent some time working as a SRE back at Twitter when Twitter was Twitter, not X. So I did some security work for them related to protecting their infrastructure against DDoS attacks and so on. And then I transitioned recently to manager of a security team. And so these days I mentioned security engineering, but yeah, my main focus is application security, cloud security, and data security as well. Now, just before we get to it, I just wanted to say, don't hesitate to ask questions during the presentation. It might be hard for me to keep an eye on the chat. So Raj and team, if you can just let me know if someone has a question, super happy to stop the presentation and address the question. We can, make this as conversational as possible rather than me just, talking the whole time. So yeah, please don't hesitate. All right, so let's start with the typical challenges that I've seen in the past, challenges that I faced myself. And I'm going to start with a theme here when it comes to managing vulnerability data, right? So the first thing that you see very common out there is, usually companies, they have a multitude of vendors. And usually these vendors, they tend to have their own dashboards with their own data, right? So if an organization has softwares like, I don't know, CrowdStrike, Wiz, or Checkmark, etc., they all tend to have their own dashboard. And the more tool you have that have their own dashboard, you tend to have multiple dashboards. So that's been the case in many organizations that have done consulting in the past. That was a bit of the case here at VTS as well in the beginning. I've even heard of organizations out there having, double digits dashboards, 10 to 20 dashboards. And so I think that the main challenge there is really, when you have your data scattered across these multitude of dashboards, it's just very hard for you to have an idea of your overall security posture, even if you have metrics in each one of these dashboards. But the main issue is that you have a lot of dashboards. So you got to go to a lot of places to figure out what's your overall posture. And then when it comes to a situation where, let's say, the board or leadership comes to you and say, okay, give me a summary, an overview of everything, and you have everything in dashboards, somehow you're going to have to collect this data. And a lot of times I've seen a lot of organizations collecting all of this data using just spreadsheets, manually entering a lot of the data into spreadsheets. I've seen also Jira boards, which tend to be a little bit easier to manage, but still, it's still a manual process that you have to do when gathering all that data, right? So these are one of the main challenges. And then another thing that I've seen a lot is the lack of security metrics. I guess a lot of organizations might think that just the number of vulnerabilities that you have might be enough to tell you it is a metric, but many times that doesn't tell the full story. So it's really hard to understand what is your overall posture if you don't have any sort of metrics in place. And it's also hard to know whether your organization risk or your product risk is increasing or decreasing over time. And I mentioned the lack of metrics. That also connects to the lack of SLA tracking, so the service level agreement. And we all understand SLA when it comes to services, but with security, a lot of times we were talking remediation SLA. So if you have a critical or a high severity finding or vulnerability, you have a certain amount of time to resolve that, because that's what you told let's say auditors for a certain compliance standard, right? So if you say that you're resolving criticals within 10 days, then the big question is, can you actually prove that you're resolving all the criticals in 10 days? And here at VTS and before, I've seen organizations managing things manually, and the challenge of managing things manually is that if you're not on top of it, if you're delayed for a day or two or three, then your SLA is going to be it's not going to be well calibrated, right? So it's going to be really, really hard to make sure that you're respecting or adhering to your company remediation SLAs. And then switching gears a little bit, another challenge that I've seen a lot, and this is something that I understand it's hard to avoid, and I'm currently still facing a little bit of that, which is, whenever you have this multitude of vulnerabilities, how many of those are actual vulnerabilities and how many of those are false positives, right? And I think the main reason for that is because a lot of the tooling out there, they don't have the business context. So I've come across a finding one day with an organization that the tool was saying that we didn't have any sort of rate limiting in place, but they were only looking at the code. But we did have rate limiting in the infrastructure level, right? So it's not that we didn't have rate limiting at all, and that could be considered a false positive, an example of a false positive. And so this lack of business context or lack of visibility across your entire code base or the infrastructure as well might lead to a lot of false positives. And I think this is something that we're improving over time. You see a lot of tooling these days using large language models to try to learn patterns. When you click something and say something is false positive, then the large language model tend to learn about that, and then going forward, ideally you would be in a better place with the tool, right? As the tool learns what is a false positive or not for your business. But I just don't think we're there yet. So this is a very common challenge that you see in many organizations. And then another thing is something I'm just calling here vulnerability ownership. And so this is basically not being able to identify who is the responsible for a certain finding. So if you're scanning a product and you find something, the question is who's supposed to remediate that? And I've been in a situation where you start bouncing back and forth between many leaders, many managers, and managers say, nope, this is not me, this is not me. So it becomes very hard for security to find exactly who is supposed to address that issue. So that's another type of challenge that I've seen a lot. Lack of automation. So I've come from a DevOps background, so I tend to automate as much as I can. And this is a common thing that you see also in security is not being able to automate configuration of the tools or the deployment. My team, because we have a DevOps background, we try to automate as much as possible. So whenever we're configuring our toolings, if the tool allows, we try to use automation either through like a script that calls an API for that vendor, or even if there is a Terraform provider or something like that we can use to automate the configuration. It's just overall a better experience because you're closer to how developers work, right? So if there's a configuration change or deployment that is happening, you know exactly when things are happening, you know exactly who made the change, you have an opportunity to approve that change and so on. So that's another common thing that I see. It's a lack of automation. And then scanning after the fact. So that's basically you run a scanner after the code has been shipped to production. This is something that is very common. I think like we're improving over time, but you still see a lot of that happening. And I think this is I'm going to talk about the conflict between security and developers, but I think that's one of the things also that help with the or not help, but in a way help with this conflict, right? It's for this conflict to increase because developers, they work in a code, they develop their feature and so on, and then they ship to production. Then a month later, security might come to them and say, hey, there's a problem with this code that you shipped a month ago. And sometimes I've seen reactions like, okay, why didn't you tell me when I was developing the code rather than a month later, right? So that's another common thing too. And connected to that and connected to the lack of automation is security usually not being engineering oriented. And by that, I mean security not following the same processes that engineering follows. And that there's a lot that goes into that, but you can think about keeping track of things on a version control system. That's an example. I've seen engineering teams that go through a process to do some of the companies they call an ADR, which is an architecture decision record, where you basically present the changes that you want to do in your architecture in your product. And a lot of these companies tend not to involve security from the get-go. So then the architecture starts developing, and by the time it gets to production, that's when security say, hey, there's a problem with your architecture. But engineering usually prefers that these kind of things are told before. And so all of these things, I would say, contributes to this kind of like conflict in a way between security and the development teams. A lot of organizations, at least from my experience, it seems that they're on different wavelengths, right? So there's a little bit of a battle sometimes. So some of these things are the things that contribute to that. Then another thing as well is not using a risk-based approach to security. And by that, I mean, let's say that you have two similar findings, two are critical. And so the question there is, if you have two criticals, how do you know which one to resolve first, right? Of course, I mean, they're both critical. You're going to have to resolve both. But if you have limited resources, you're going to have to choose where to start. And so if you don't take a look at like holistically in your product, what's the risk that finding brings to your product, you just take a look at the severity and nothing else, then you can't really figure out which one you should start with, right? So you might start with the wrong one when the other one presents more risk to your product. So that's what I mean by not taking risk into consideration when you're doing things like prioritizing the work. And then just the last thing is no proper training. I think this is also connected to the type of conflict that I mentioned about security and devs, which is, and I've seen this many times, is, I'll give an example. Let's say as a security team, you deploy a DAST that starts heating up a website, right? Or your internal website, whatever it is. And then developers see weird traffic coming to it and they don't know what's happening, right? So they might reach out to security teams, say, hey, there is something happening here. Someone is trying to like send weird requests to my website, and security might say, well, that's us, that's our tool. And usually developers are confused. They're like, okay, which tool are you talking about? I didn't know about any tool. So that's why I'm saying that like it's very important for security to try to get into the same wavelength, the same process that engineering follows. Here, at least at VTS with my team, we try to get involved from the get-go. Whenever we're introducing new tools, we go and we pitch that to engineering, say, hey, we're gonna do this. Anyone has any issues? Sometimes developers say, hey, I don't think this is gonna work. So we start a conversation. I think that's the most important thing. It's have an open line of communication with the engineering teams, and I think these are some of the things that might help lower the conflict. Right? I mean, I think there is a lot of things out there. Of course, this is not by any means a comprehensive set of challenges. I'm pretty sure some of you have seen a lot of different challenges. But these are, just some of the main ones that came to mind when I was, building this presentation. And so let's talk about the journey, things that I've done in the past, things that I've seen in the past, and things that I've done, especially here at VTS as well. So I basically did a kind of a step-by-step. Of course, that it's sometimes it might be hard to go through every single step, but this is just a suggestion that I'll give to security leaders out there to try it out and see. Some of the things definitely worked for me in the past, and so starting out with the first step here that I think a lot of security teams miss is understanding how to map your product with your code base, right? So one of the things that my team did early on in the process was to first take a look at all of the repos that we have, and including the paths within a repo. In the case, let's say if you have a mono repo where you have multiple types of application. So you first analyze all of your repos and all of the paths within a repo. And you try to identify which repos or paths they belong to a certain product, right? So in my case here, we have 5 different line of products. And so the first step for us is we picked a few products, 1 or 2, and we try to identify where is the code base for that product. Again, I mentioned in the beginning, this might not apply to everyone. If you're a big enterprise organization, it might be really, really hard to do something like that. But if you're on the smaller, mid-size, it might be a little bit easier. And so that was the first step that we personally followed. So we just try to map the code base that we have with the products that we have. And then after that, you gotta think about the domains that you wanna scan. So you've got your code base, you've got the dependencies for the code base, you've got things like secrets, you've got your version control system, infrastructure runtime, containers, etc. So pick 1, 2, or 3 of these domains to get started with, right? So the third step here, as you can see, is to choose 2 to 3 scanners to roll out in the beginning to start gathering data. And the type of scanners that you roll out here depends on the domains that you define and you choose in step 2. So in our case, we chose code base, dependencies, and secrets. So we roll out a SAS, we roll out an SCA, and we rolled out a secret scanning tool in the beginning. And so the reason for avoiding to roll out a large number of scanners is to prevent some sort of overloading, right? Because if you're an organization that you're trying to establish your program, so let's say developers, they don't have this mindset of triaging things, prioritizing, remediating, and so on. If you introduce a lot of data to them, it's not going to work out. So in our case, we only choose a couple of scanners first because we wanted to establish the program, establish the process. And then once we get to a point where everyone is familiar with how it works, introducing new domains will be much easier because they understand the process. It's just the type of vulnerability will be different. It might be infrastructure, runtime, etc. But the process will be relatively the same. So that's why we chose to start with a smaller number of scanners to later on increase them. And so as you roll out these, different types of scanners, you got to gather that data. Remember, many organizations, they have a lot of dashboards out there, but it's important for you to centralize things, have a single pane of glass for all of your vulnerability data. And so that's when I recommend an ASPM. And, of course, being here in Purple community, Armor Code is one of my favorite tools for when it comes to ASPM. And if you're not familiar with ASPM, ASPM is basically a vendor that helps you correlate and analyze data from different sources, so you can easily triage, prioritize, and remediate your vulnerabilities. And for us, it was really important to choose a tool agnostic vendor to maximize our integration. And the reason for that is because in the past, we tried to choose a vendor that had a dashboard, had a SaaS, and so on. But then we're like, okay, we have this other tool here. Can we integrate that data into your tool? And they said no. So what did that mean? So that mean we had this tool, but then we had the other one, and they were totally separate entities, and we would have to go back and forth to try to analyze the data. And so for us, we're like, no, we got to choose a tool that is agnostic to vendors, because this way we can integrate literally everything that we have, right? So that was a very important consideration for us. And then once you have your ASPM, you have all of your data being aggregated in a single place. When you talk to leadership about risk, they want to understand what's the risk for a certain product, right? If you just show that, oh, we have, I don't know, 10,000 vulnerabilities, and even if it were to show per repo, they still don't know what that means, right? And that was, I think GitHub, they take that approach where they have a dashboard, but they show you the repos, right? So it's, for leadership, they don't know what a repo is or how it maps to a product. So that's why step one is important for you to do this mapping. But then even a product itself, it can be a very big entity, right? So usually a product, you have tens or maybe hundreds of teams working on that product. So it's important for you to break it down as much as you can into smaller components so that it's easier for you to identify the teams working on these smaller components. And here I'm going to use the language called a subproduct. So subproduct is basically a smaller component within a product. So one product is composed of multiple subproducts. And ideally, each one of these subproducts, they're connected with a team, right? And the reason to connect these subproducts to a team, there's a step for us to do that later. But the reason to do that is back when I said that it's hard to see, or it's hard to have finding ownership or find the right team to resolve an issue. Now here, if you break your product to smaller components and you know exactly which team is working on that component and there's a vulnerability associated with that, then it's much easier for you to go to that team and say, hey, this is part of your code base, or this is your dependency or secret. So, this is your responsibility basically to remediate. So that's the exercise that we went through. We basically connected with a lot of the engineering teams, and we basically asked, okay, let's take this product and let's understand what is the product composed of. What are the smaller components of these products? And just make a pause. Raj, I don't know if there's any questions so far. Just checking the chat here.
Yeah, I see Rajiv has a question. And there are some observations too. Before that, before I go to Raju, there is one comment from Mayank. Points 5 and 6 are exactly where you drive more maturity with respect to automation on ticketing to send tickets to owners. So that's his point of view there. Sanket, would you want to add a tool for devs to find and fix issues at commit before or after introducing scanners? Example, depend about in the journey.
Sorry, let me just read again. Tool for devs to find
the last two ones.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So that's one thing that we started doing more and more. So with some of the things that I'm mentioning here is the way we configure in my team was initially when the code is merged to the main branch, that's when we started doing the scan, right? I mean, this is already better because you pick things up before it goes to production because you just merged to the main branch, but it's still after development might have finished. So what we started doing was introducing tools that during the development, so the developers in their IDE, then there's a plugin that tells you, hey, there might be a problem here. Or then they go and create a pull request or a merge request. And then right there and then there's a comment that say, I found a potential issue with the new code that you're introducing here. And you give them an opportunity to fix the issue before things are merged. So I think that's ideally, that's where, teams should go towards, is like as close as possible to when the developers are writing the code, because it's much easier to fix then rather than wait until it goes all the way to production. So yeah, so tools like the Penabot, I think with the GitHub, they have their code scanning tool that they're introducing more of a Gen AI approach to it. Then whenever you create a PR, then it scans the code and tells you what could be wrong. So yeah, I definitely recommend that approach. Just reading so Rajiv's question, what are your thoughts on remediation related to open source? So Rajiv, I'm trying to understand your question. So you mean you're comparing remediating vulnerabilities in open source versus the code that you're writing in-house? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so we used to have this debate every time that, uh, after you do the scans, you see, all these vulnerabilities that come through. And we used to rate them as low, medium, and high. And depending on the severities, we would put out a plan of saying when and who would remediate it, right? Especially with open code, it was always, hey, we need this library and this is already built in, and I'll do it next 2 weeks or the next sprint cycle, and it never get done.
Mm-hmm.
And related to that, now especially, people are using your whatever AI engines you have to create code that that's satisfies a particular function, but now that code's not yours, right? And now you also have to integrate that, or you gotta cut and paste it into your own code, and hey, that creates other issues that you may not be aware of, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least in my team, like regardless if you wrote the code or not, if it's like a library, but you are using that library directly in the code base that you're writing, at least my team, we see that as that team's responsibility, right? Regardless if they wrote the code or not. Usually when it comes to tools like the Penabot or other SCAs, it's more of a, hey, upgrade the version because there's a new patch or whatever it is. So we expect them to take that with the same priority compared to the findings that are related to the code that they wrote, right? So if there is a patch that is a critical, we see that as the same way as a critical that, something critical in your code. So that's the approach we're trying to take. It's like, doesn't matter if you wrote the code or not. If you're using that library, then it is your responsibility to treat it in the same way.
cool. Thanks.
Okay. All righty. Okay, so coming back here to step 6, so I mentioned breaking down the product into these smaller components called subproduct, and so the same way that in the beginning we did a mapping between where is the code base for a product. Now that we broke it down into smaller components, you also need to understand where is that code, right? So it's kind of like the same exercise again. So once you get together with the team, you break down the product into smaller components. We went through all the smaller components and we try to identify where is the code located to that. And you understand the reason why you have to do that. This is not just information just to have it. It will be important at some point. But that's the the step that we followed once we broke down the product. And then we're talking products, subproducts, and so on. Now, when you start representing your products, there needs to be a way to show that in your ASPM, right? So, some SPM Armor code, for sure, they do that. You can represent a product, right? So you create an entity within that SPM, which is called the product name. And then within that product, you can have the smaller components. The reason my team was looking for something like that is because in the beginning, we try to leverage other vendors that they were basically telling you what's the number of vulnerabilities per repo. But then again, if you talk to leadership, they don't understand what a repo is and how that maps into a product, right? So that's why we first go through this exercise of, hey, you've got this product for your end consumers. This is how this product is represented internally when you think about our code base. And if you want leadership to go to your ASPM, let's say, and take a look at a dashboard that we're going to be talking soon, somehow you're going to say, hey, the product A has this risk, right? So somehow you need to be able to represent that product in your ASPM. So that's what this step is about. I'm not sure about all the ASPMs out there if they provide that functionality, but if they do, that's personally something that we've done. We created this representation. And so once you have this representation, then it's time to integrate all of your security tools. So again, in our case, we started with 2 or 3. And then what we did was we first rolled it out for all of the repos for the products that we identified in the beginning that we wanted to start with. And so once we had all these tools running, it was time to integrate with the ASPM. So we configured all these tools to send all of the data to the ASPM. And when we did that, that's the step where you define where that finding is going. And I've seen this question before. It's like, I've got all this data going to my ASPM, but I'm just like centralizing everything, but I still can't figure out, which product each finding belongs to. And so I'm talking about Armor Code because that's what my company has used, and we've got a lot of experience with it. So in terms of Armor Code specifically, other SPM might have something similar to that. Is there is a technology that they call a runbook. And so basically with the runbook, when you get a finding that comes from your repo, that runbook takes a look at the path of the file that has that vulnerability. Once it takes a look at the path, it needs to know which product and which smaller component or subproduct that belongs to. And that's why it was important for us to do the mapping before to get to this point, because now by looking at the path of a file or a folder, whatever it is, we know which product or which smaller component that file or folder belongs to. And once we configure all of that, then we get to a point where in our ASPM, we go into a product, we go into a smaller component, a subproduct, and we see exactly all of the findings that are related to that component. So that's why we went through that exercise of doing all the mapping, so that we can connect these things once we start ingesting all of the data. And then once we got to that point where we had all of the findings, we have defined the products, the smaller components, and so on, then it came time to define the metrics and also create the dashboards, right? So this is a step where we had to think about what are the metrics that are important to the business, and of course, that required a lot of conversation with the leadership. And so we came up with a couple of metrics. Here are some examples of metrics that you can use, like what's the risk score of that product, what's the number of vulnerabilities that have been remediated, what's the percentage of your remediation SLA, are you 100% adhering to your SLA or not? So these are some of the metrics that you can configure when you're setting up your dashboard. But the function of the dashboards is for a leader to go there and say, okay, what's the risk of my product? Is it going down? Is it going up? That's the whole point of this, is to have a summary of the key metrics for leadership. Right? So that's the approach that we took. So we defined the metrics that were important to them, and we created a dashboard to aggregate to first take all of this data that has been ingested, create all these metrics, and then present them in a form of a dashboard. Now, step 10, and I put a little star there because this is not something that I don't know if all ASPMs do something like that. But again, we working with Armor Code, that's something that we leverage, which is something we call the asset scoring. And so the reason for having something like this is, and I think I gave this example before. So if you have two criticals, which one do you know is more critical than the other? If you only look at the severity, it's hard, right? So you need to have some sort of criteria that you use in order to be able to prioritize, right? So then in our case, what we did was we thought about what was certain criteria that are important for us. Is it the existence of PII? Is it the fact that a product is exposed on the internet? So you think about all these things that can carry risk to your product, and you list that as like categories, right? And then based on these categories, you can assign weights to it. So let's say if your product has PII, maybe it has a bigger weight, right? Or if it has, let's say, material non-public information, it has a certain weight. So all of these different weights that are assigned to these categories, they are taken into consideration when calculating the risk of the product or the risk of a finding, right? And so that's the way we introduce this kind of like business context to say, hey, this product here, if there's a finding for it, this is a little bit more critical than another product, right? So that's how basically we do that. We leverage this thing called asset scoring, which is a component in the calculation of the risk that takes into account different categories in things about the product. So that was the next step for us. Once we had the dashboard, we had to adjust our risk score, because before, all of the products we're seeing as exactly the same level of risk. And for us, it's not. There are some products that are more risky than others. So we had to differentiate them. And that's how we did with the asset scoring. Yeah. And then step 11 for us was to do the mapping of a team and a subproduct. So I mentioned that before back in step 6, I think, that the reason for you to break down a product into smaller components is so that you can easily identify who is responsible for that product or subproduct, right? And so for you to be able to do that, you got to do a mapping, and that's what we did. So we connected with all of our engineering teams, and when we talked to them, we're trying to define, hey, this is how we broke things down in terms of products and smaller components. Which smaller components does your team or is your team responsible for, right? So when we gather all this data, again, back to your ASPM, you should be able to configure each one of these teams and assign these teams to a certain component. Because then the moment the finding comes from your version control system, it goes through some sort of automation that identifies that this finding belongs to this product and this smaller component. When you get to that point, you know exactly what is the team that is responsible for that component. And that's how we're able to go straight to the right team, because we've done this exercising of understanding what components each team is responsible for. And then now, once you've done all of that, this is not going to work if you don't have your developers on board with you. So the approach that we took was to do a lot of training when it came to vulnerability management. We were doing brown bags presentation internally and during all hands and all this sort of things, because we wanted to educate them. How do they triage findings, right? Like, we're introducing a new ASPM and tools. What are these? How do you actually log into it? And what do you actually do to triage a finding? And back to that issue that I mentioned before was, if you introduce tools and you don't tell your engineering teams how to use it, or even that the tools exist, it's going to be hard for them to get on board with the same process. So what we did was we were very transparent, say, hey, these are the tools we're introducing. This is how it works. This is the expectations that we have from you to do the triaging. Our team is very small. We can't possibly triage every single product's vulnerability. So this is what we expect you to do. And so during, we had like multiple sessions. It took us maybe 2 months or so to go through all of the teams and, do all of this training. But then we got to a point where the teams were kind of like self-sufficient. So they would go to the SPM, they would take the findings related to their component, right? They knew exactly that finding was for them, and they started already creating the tickets. Usually ASPM, they have this automation that someone mentioned in the chat to create the tickets and so on. And so it became a very like a well-oiled machine for all of the teams once we done this training. And I think this training was critical, because without the training, I don't think anyone would go to the SPM and start triaging anything. So that's a crucial step that we took. And then I mentioned about having an open line of communication. So, it should not be dev versus security, right? So in our case, we introduce office hours. So every single week we dedicate 30 to 6 minutes. Hey, you guys can come here and join our call if you have a question about a certain finding that you found in the ASPM, or anything else related to security. Let's discuss it. Right. So, and we also have a Slack channel, right? So people can just reach out there on the channel. So I think this is how you start breaking down this barrier between the security and the devs, is just being open to communicate, being transparent with the things that you are introducing and how that's going to affect them. Right. And so that, has been working out for us pretty well. We always get people interacting with us via Slack or during the office hours to ask questions. And you see that this way, security seems a little bit less intimidating for teams, because that's what I came across a lot. Security tends to be very intimidating for folks. And so having this open line of communication usually tends to help. And then I'm almost done. So step 14 was to actually review the metrics, because you can set up all of the metrics you want, all of the dashboards. If no one is taking a look at it, doesn't really matter, right? So we gotta make sure that at least us on a quarterly basis, we're getting together with the teams, reviewing the metrics that they have. If we see that a metric, let's say the risk is increasing, or say, hey, we got to do something about here because the risk is increasing. And so this is just a way for the teams to really take advantage of all the tool that we set up, because we don't want to do all of this for nothing, right? Just to say that we have in place, we need to make use of that. So that's what we basically do on a regular basis. We're reviewing all of the metrics and so on with the teams. And then the last step is really to repeat all of it, right? I mean, like in our case, we started with 1 to 2 products. We had a couple of more. So we just went back and applied the same things that we learned to all of the other products. If you start with 1 or 2 domains, maybe just code base and dependencies, but you have many other things, infrastructure, containers, runtime, etc., then it's time to expand to these other domains and kind of like follow the same process. And expanding domains means rolling out new scanners and so on. Now, some of these things you're probably not gonna have to do it again. Let's say, well, like identifying the products or sub products, unless of course your product line changes. Maybe there's a new product that is being introduced. Then of course you would have to go through the exercise again. But otherwise, it's a how do you say, iterative process, right? You're gonna have to go through again and again and again until you master it. But the thing that I've seen some organizations doing is they try to introduce everything at once, all the scanners, all the tools, right? And then it's just hard for engineering teams to follow. So start with small number of tools, of domains. Get this well-oiled machine working for developers to get used to the process. And then as they're used to the process, then introducing new scanners and so on, it's just a matter of a new type of findings. But the process they're gonna be used to.